The sermon is this morning about talking about bold faith and action. And when we think about boldness, it's usually kind of got a connotation of like a loud and direct action. I'm a pretty loud guy. I'm a pretty boisterous person when I want to be. Oftentimes, I actually don't need a microphone because my voice carries. And when we think of bold faith, we think of just big things, right? We always go to a lot of things like that. And often as we see living a life with boldness, we kind of think of us on the front line of our culture leading the way. Maybe through our voices or our direct works, we think of people that we've seen doing things that are on the news or in public. We think of bold faith in that way. But while God did do a great deal of work throughout Scripture with bold and loud ways, for instance, Moses parting the Red Sea was not a calm, quiet deal. He stood there and the entire water moved. Or, for instance, Samson's superhuman strength, or even Paul's boldness making declarations in prison about Jesus. Those are pretty bold moves. While God does that a lot, he also uses a lot of subtle and indirect ways and means to accomplish great works. So we think of boldness oftentimes that way, but boldness doesn't necessarily mean loud, direct, and in your face. I think boldness means being willing to do and accomplish things when, honestly, we're scared to do that. There's a lot of things that scare me and that I'm intimidated by. And I'm not going to lie to you, I'm going to try my best often to not let people know that I'm scared about them, but I'm intimidated by a lot of things. Even with, like my children, I try to be the dad. I'm not going to be scared about things. And so the other day, we went to the Natural History Museum in Salt Lake City, and we walk outside and there's a sign that says, hey, there's lots of rattlesnakes here. I love rattlesnakes. Not one bit. And my wife and my son start walking, and all of a sudden we hear it, and they stop, and Jenny knows what's going on, and she looks, and Ryan kind of looks at her, and they come walking back. So I'm pretending to be cool here, right? I'm like, okay, I'm going to be bold for my kids. They're going to think I'm so I walked a little bit closer, and I heard it again. And I'm like, all right, let's go back inside. That intimidates me, right? I'm scared just like the next person. But God's not always asking me to lead in that kind of direct way. I often interpret it that way. Yeah, that's what God wants. He wants me to be in the front line, loud and boisterous. And Nehemiah kind of shows us today, we're in chapter 2 today, a little bit more of how God uses all things for his glory. Those indirect and direct means, and how it's not always the loud and in your face. Sometimes it's the silent prayer warrior in the corner. It goes both directions. Chapter 1, Bobby talked about last week. God has put a righteous cause on Nehemiah's heart. That cause was seeing the wall in Jerusalem broken down and his people living in disobedience broke his heart, and he wanted to be an active part of seeing that change. If you remember, Bobby reminded us last week that righteous causes are ignited by God, fueled by God, and finished by God. And so Nehemiah has had this put on his heart, and he's going to move into what God has put on his heart in this chapter 2. We're going to kind of see this bold faith in action. If you have your Bibles, I'm going to start in Nehemiah chapter, actually the very end of chapter 1, and the last part of verse 11 into chapter 2. And I'm going to read this section at a time, so we're going to go through verse 5 right now. Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 11 says at the very end, now I was a cupbearer to the king, in chapter 2, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine, and I gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence, and the king had said to me, why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart. Then I was much afraid, and I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruin, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? And I'm going to read verse 4 as well. Then the king said to me, what are you requesting? So I prayed to the God of heaven. So here's what's important as we're seeing here. Nehemiah starts off with what I like to call faithful patience. Now I'm not going to lie to you. I'm the last person that can boast patience. I don't understand it well. I'm not good at it. I don't respond well to being patient. But oftentimes God moves in ways and times that don't ever pertain to my timeline. He's got things going on, and I'm ready to go, and I'm ready to do, and it just doesn't play out that way. And so Nehemiah, and it says in the month of Nisan in the 20th year of Artaxerxes, the month of Nisan is kind of what this is saying. It's been a little bit of time since Nehemiah first had that prayer and he was concerned before he goes to Artaxerxes. There's maybe about 4 months time there before he goes in. And so he's had time. And what he's been doing during that time is he's been praying. You saw in chapter 1, he's on his knees and he's faithfully being patient and praying, God, what do I do? What do you want from me? There have been a few months, and so he's been praying and planning for the right opportunity to arise. He needed to wait. Now, we know a little bit about waiting. God talks to us like for instance, in Exodus chapter 14, verse 13 says, and Moses said to the people, fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. Now, oftentimes when we think we're tasked with an opportunity, we feel like the first thing we need to do is just to go and be actively involved. And oftentimes God's saying, hold up for a second, be patient, and let me do the work that I'm about to do. So Nehemiah is patiently waiting on God. He's fervently praying for God. He's being silent. We also, in Psalm chapter 46, verse 10 reminds us, and we know this one, verse 10, be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted on the earth. You can see in his life and action that he fully believes what God has promised in these things. To be still, to wait. I will do the fighting. You just need to be patient on me. And so Nehemiah's got this burden on his heart, and his first response is not to go like a crazy person and take care of it. His first response is being patient. And Nehemiah is sitting back and he's fervently praying and he's waiting for the right time. He's waiting for it to open up and he goes before the king and all of a sudden the right time eventually plays out. Now there's a possibility too, him being the cupbearer. Now what a cupbearer's job is he's the guy that gets to taste everything before the king gets it. So in case someone's trying to kill the king, they kill Nehemiah first. It's a great job. The benefits are fantastic. He loves it. But at the same time, he's in front of the king all the time. And one of the things, too, when you're in front of the king, you don't get to bring your home issues into work life, right? That's the scenario where your job is to make the king happy, and he doesn't really care what's going on at home. And so Nehemiah comes in, and it's a danger for him to even express concern because the king doesn't care about his personal. He's the cupbearer. His job is to only do one thing and make sure the king is safe. That's his job. And the king sees it on his face, and he can interpret that a couple ways, especially since he hasn't seen this before because it's the first time the king's really concerned. Either Nehemiah's sick, or maybe something's going on with this guy that I don't know. So he asks Nehemiah, what's going on? And Nehemiah responds, of course we know we just read, Nehemiah carried a respect, here's why his face is so sad, a respect for his ancestry and a shame for the current condition of the city. And he just couldn't weigh that on his heart anymore. He was so broken about what was not happening in Jerusalem that he couldn't even keep himself contained. And the king notices. Now, when you sit and wait on the Lord in prayer, you're not wasting your time, you're investing in it. God is preparing both you and your circumstances so that his purposes will be accomplished. However, when the right time arrives for us to act by faith, we should not delay. Nehemiah was waiting and waiting and waiting, praying for God to give him the opportunity, and the opportunity arose. Have you ever done that? Have you ever asked God, give me an opportunity? I've done that before, and the thing is, God tends to do that. And so you got to be prepared when you're asking God to give you that opportunity because he tends to hear that prayer. He's like, okay, you want to do something for me, here you go. One of the prayers I used to make, and I still try to make, I say used to, but I also know that God is very faithful and committed to hearing me, is God, give me an opportunity to share with someone today. I just want an opportunity. And you know what he tended to do? Every day I had an opportunity to share with someone. And so I had to be prepared to actually act on it. And sometimes, I was like, I didn't really mean that, God. I was really just kind of wanting to be faithful to you. But, we have to be prepared oftentimes. And Nehemiah was a guy that was ready and waiting in prayer, faithfully and patiently waiting. Now, our culture tells us to not be patient and faithful in those things. We have to get things now and quick. We want it today. We don't want it tomorrow. We want in everything. Our food, now I'm the worst when it comes to that. I don't want to wait. And, I try to be really cool when a waitress is like, hey, it's going to be a few minutes. I'm like, okay. But we've been trained to get things immediately. We can go to the store and buy something immediately. We can go get our gas in our car immediately. We can go wherever we want immediately. We can get on airplanes. And while it's not an immediate, we can get across the world. And what would normally take, months, we can do it in days. And our culture tells us patience is not something we need because we can have it today, like our phones, right? You can get access to everything you need. One of my favorite things to do is ask a group of guys, hey, what was the score yesterday? And everybody's going to, hold on. They're going to pull it out and see who gets it first, right? And it's a real easy game to play, and you find out who's got what phones real quick because they're going to be like, hey, it's right here. We want it now. Our culture's told us. But the thing is, on our spiritual life, it doesn't work that way because God's not promising us today to have everything we need or want. He's saying, you be faithful to me and you be silent, and I'm going to do great things. But sometimes it's going to take my time, not your time. I'm going to do it when I'm ready to do it. And as a believer, I struggle with that because I want God to do great things yesterday. I want God to do great things now. And I think sometimes, because my impatience, I miss out on a lot of what he's doing in front of me because I'm so eager. But Nehemiah was patient. He faithfully prayed, and at the right opportunity, the king opened up and asked the question, and he was able to move forward, which leads us into our second point. We're going to pick up in verse 5. Then king said, or that was verse 4, verse 5, and I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. And the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, how long will you be gone, and when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah, and a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy. And the king granted me what I had asked, for the good hand of God was upon me. So he is faithfully patient. He's waiting. He's been bathing this in prayer, consistently praying, God, show me what to do. It just isn't working. Show me what to do. And finally, he gets the opportunity. And here's the next thing. He has a faithful request. Verse 5, and he said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. Oftentimes, faithful prayer will lead you to faithful action. And Nehemiah had been faithfully waiting for the right time, and God revealed it when the king addressed him. But he didn't know necessarily at the time that Nehemiah was going to be the one to fix the problem. He was just faithfully asking God to do some work. He wasn't, here's what I think it's important to me. He wasn't saying, God, use me to do great things so that I can be great. He's saying, God, I need you to restore your home. I need you to restore Jerusalem back to where it was, and it's breaking my heart. He wasn't really knowing that that opportunity was going to be for him. But he took opportunity because all of a sudden the king gives him the voice to say, hey, what's going on? And Nehemiah's like, here's the problem. And he opens up his heart, and he was faithfully requesting. Verse 6, and the king said to me, how long will you be gone, and when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me when I give him a time. So after the king sees his concern, and he shares with the king his need, the king asks him, how long does this take? Let me ask you this question. Have you ever prayed without anticipation for God actually providing for the thing that you asked for? You didn't actually think he was going to do it. Not that you doubt God, but sometimes things are bigger than what we can understand. We're very linear people. We're logical. So asking God to move mountains is not something we understand. I think sometimes I do that. I pray, I'm like, God, if you could restore this relationship. It's not that I doubt him. It's really messed up. And then God does that very thing, and it almost shocks me as if I shouldn't have already believed that God could do it. And Nehemiah was one of those, when God answered the prayer, he wasn't shocked because he believed so much that's the God he serves was ready to work, that he was able to give an answer. He was able to ask the request. Nehemiah was ready to go. I think we have to be careful as believers sometimes to understand the power of prayer. One of the reasons why Bobby shared what he shared with a minute ago is because we know the most important and valuable thing about seeing the gospel carried across the world is the power of prayer. We have direct communication with the creator of the universe, and we can't take it for granted. And we know that Nehemiah knew that, and when the king gave him the opportunity, he was ready to respond quickly. I sometimes think myself when I get questions thrown at me how ill-prepared I am for things, because it's like I didn't actually think God was actually going to do it. And it's not that I don't trust God. I just know I'm pretty broken person. I really have a lot of issues that I'm not prepared for. And so sometimes I doubt not so much God's ability to do it, but my ability to be able to fit into his plan. And Nehemiah was ready to go. And we as believers have to be careful not to doubt that God's going to do the very things that he's promised to do, and that's to make his glory shown. Verse 7, Nehemiah starts doing something that a lot of, I'm not going to lie, I don't think, of the three of us, Daniel, Bobby, and myself, I think Daniel's very much a guy that's going to prepare, and Bobby and I are the kind of guys that are going to make Daniel sweat it out a little bit, because we're not as good at preparing and thinking through things as much as he is. And that's why I love the team dynamic, because we all bring something to the table. He's like, listen, if you're going to send me, I know how this is going to go down. I need your approval so I can send to these leaders that I need to go build this wall. I need to start preparing. Often we pray without preparing, and Nehemiah knew that he would need these letters for so he could be safe as he's going to continue to do the work that God's called him to do. He's thinking through the big picture all the way across the board. I've asked God to do this great thing, and as God's going to do this, and I believe God's going to do it, I need to do my part. And I know if I'm going to go over here, I'm going to need all these guys on board. And the one way they're going to be on board is if the king gives me approval. We talked about that in Ezra, right? Artaxerxes' hand was kind of astonishing that sometimes God uses people who are not even for him for his glory. And so Artaxerxes is a part of this. And Nehemiah knew, I need to prepare to get this done. Verse 8. In a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's force, that he may give timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress temple, and for the house that I shall occupy. And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. So he's going through the list of everything he needs. One of the things, I don't know if you ever noticed, if you ever go to Lowe's or Home Depot, my father-in-law was one of these guys. When he would prepare something, he'd have a list. And every possible thing he could need on this list. And I love it when I go to Lowe's or Home Depot. There's usually older guys, and they know better than guys like me, because I never know what I need, and I make multiple trips. He goes and he pulls out his pad, and he'll go find every possible thing he needs for his project. And he had it all written down in your hand. I could put it on my phone and I still miss everything. Nehemiah is meticulously planning every possible need he could have. He's like, I'm going to need timber. I'm going to need this, and King, I'm going to need you to give me the approval for all of it. So he's getting ready. He's asking everything he's going to need on the front end. He's like, listen, I've already thought through this. Here's the plan. This is what needs to happen. So he was faithfully willing to ask. It was a faithful request. He was patient, and then when the opportunity arose, he was like, listen, this is what we need. And I'm often intimidated sometimes to ask things of other people. I go through my head on whether or not they're going to respond the way I need them to. It intimidates me. I don't have a problem talking to people, but asking things of them bothers me sometimes. But when God is doing things, I don't need to worry or care about what they think. If that's the thing God's put on our hearts, we need to lay out there, listen, this is what we need. I think it's funny in a church plant like Redemption, there's oftentimes things that we don't know. Unless we ask, people will provide. Unless we're willing to say, listen, this is the mission that God's put up on our heart. What do you think? When I was starting to try to get some support, one of the things that God put on my heart is I don't need to worry about asking about supporting Redemption. I just need to do the asking. God will do the part of working on hearts, and those that need to will, and those that don't need to won't. So Nehemiah was faithful in his requests, which leads us to the last half of this section here, Nehemiah chapter 2. Verse 9, then I came to the governors of the province beyond the river, and I gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent with me officers of the army and horsemen. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel. So I went to Jerusalem, and there was 3 days, and was there 3 days. And I rose in the night, and I and a few men with me, and I told no one what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me but the one on which I rode. I went out by night by the valley gate to the dragon spring and to the dung gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down and its gates and had been destroyed by fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool. but there was no room for the animal that was there under me to pass. Then I went up in the night by the valley and inspected the wall, and I turned back and entered by the valley gate and so returned. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing. I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who were to do the work. This is kind of important and interesting part of this. So while he was faithful in his patience, he had a faithful patience, he had a faithful request, now comes the faithful preparation. He had a big task ahead, and what he does is amazing here. So he talks about that he came to the governors of the province beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent him with the officers of the army and the horsemen. We talked about this in Ezra. Ezra decided to go to Jerusalem and do this without the king's support, if you remember. The difference with Nehemiah was Nehemiah knew that the way these leaders were going to pay attention is if the king Artaxerxes' hand was upon this. So instead, he goes with the king's support so that these officials would. Because you also remember, there's some, not everyone agrees that Jerusalem needs to be built back up and that these walls should be built. Not everyone is on board with this idea, and there was some dissension. The king himself, at one point, had paused the building, and he kind of flip-flops a little bit there. So the king's support was important here. So he goes in with the king's support, with the military, a little bit different, and not because he was scared, not because he was afraid, but because he knew this is what needed to happen for the officials to follow and be on board with this. The next verse talks about Sanballat and Tobiah and how they weren't going to be really happy about the situation. Earlier in the reign of Artaxerxes, their complaints against Jerusalem had been accepted by the king. So the Sanballat and Tobias and their people would complain to the king about Jerusalem, and he's like, okay, I hear you. And he's the one that decreed the Jews to stop building. So now a Jew coming as a governor with authorization to build was a pretty disturbing deal for them. So he's going to come back with the king's approval now. And so Nehemiah is not foolish. He understands what's in front of him, and he understands not everybody's on board. And so he's recognizing that, and he realizes there's going to be some tension. So verse 11 kind of talks about what he does. And this is where I really appreciate, because I struggle a little bit personally with this part. So not with what Nehemiah did, but myself. So when I went to Jerusalem and was there 3 days, and I arose in the night, and I and a few men, and I told no one what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. And there was no animal with me but the one which I rode. So Nehemiah was going to prove himself in this whole situation as a good worker, but hard work alone does not ensure success. It must be the right work at the right time, done the right way. And this takes planning, and it takes faithfulness. One of the things he does is he doesn't share with anyone what he's doing, and intentionally keeps this to himself. Nehemiah knows that there's opposition, and so the preparation part was going to be his. So he's going to prepare for what God is doing, and he keeps it to himself. Now here's where I struggle. I'm the kind of guy that's going to share with you everything about my life. I'm going to tell you every spiritual issue I've got, everything. One of the stories about my own personal growth, and Daniel and I were talking about this week, that I struggle with. So when I was younger in ministry, I had this great idea. I was concerned for the youth ministry I was working at. I really felt I wanted God to do some great things, so I decided, you know what, I'm going to spend some time fasting so that I can really just humble myself before God and allow God to. Now here's the thing about fasting. It's really not meant to be a public ordeal. It's really meant to be a private situation between you and God, where you and God, you're going before the Lord, giving of yourself so that you can go honestly before him so he can do the work. Now, I chose to go a different route with that. I decided to go with some of my friends that I knew really well, and I was like, hey man, I'm going to fast and pray for this, and I look back at my life, and actually I think one of us were talking this morning what we were like before in ministry, and I learned from those things, but I've made this a big deal because I wanted to, in my head, I thought that's what I needed to do, and so I was talking to my friend, and I remember him clearly looking at me like, why are you telling me this? And I didn't understand at the time because I was trying to make a big deal of my spiritual discipline, right, because I'm such a righteous guy. And he's kind of looking at me like, no, Nick, this is not something you do publicly. This is something you do privately in preparation between you and God. This is not something to be made known for everyone. We have this tendency in a very glorifying culture, even as pastors, that we want, as we're doing God's work, for it to look good on us. Like, yeah, I was a part of that. I'm doing that. And sometimes our tendency is when we kind of sabotage ourselves because we're not faithfully just letting God do what he needs to do. We openly let it be out there for everyone to kind of dissect and pick apart. Have you ever had an idea that you threw out and then everyone else totally went away with it? And they were like, I don't like that idea, or they change it here and they change it there, because we didn't do any faithful planning. Nehemiah knew if he was going to bring this to the table, he's going to get all the details and the specs ready to go. So that when he comes to bring this before the officials, there's no stone unturned. There's nothing ready to go. So God was ready to move. Now, that's the part where I struggle with. I'm not really good at keeping to myself that spiritual discipline of letting God talk to me on my own terms and to be silent and wait on him, right? That be still part in Psalms is a part I struggle with. I'm not a still guy, but God works on me often. He said, Nick, just calm down and wait, because when you do, I will be able to do great things. So Nehemiah keeps it quiet, intentionally keeps it to himself. He's praying and trusting that God does not mean that research is not necessary, though. That's something we need to understand. When we talk about waiting on God, does not mean we don't continue to do things for him. That just means our actions need to wait until God's ready for us to go. We have to prepare still. We still have to think through what God's calling us to do. We still have to do the right things. And then when God does give us the clear indication of, hey, I want you to do this, we're ready to go. He wanted to assess the situation before presenting his project to the officials and the people. The preparation helped him not to gain any more opposition than there was already going to be. Because that's the thing. If you start letting everyone hear about it, the sand ballot, these other guys are going to hear, and they're going to be able to throw rocks into the game plan before it's even off the ground. And so he intentionally knew that I need to keep this to myself. I need to pray through this, and when the time is right, I'm going to show it to everyone. I've worked with leaders before where, you give them an idea that's not really thought through, it's not going to go anywhere. But if you brought the idea together with all the plans in place, they're like, okay, let's give it a try. And I learned a long time ago, sometimes it's not the idea that's not good, it's just that an idea in itself doesn't do us any good. But an idea that's been prayed through and thought through is actually helpful and useful in ministry. And so Nehemiah was ready to do all the groundwork before it was ready to go. So the preparation helped him. I already just said that. So verse 13 on, Nehemiah is starting to assess the different walls and getting a visual for where the walls were going to be placed. And he's also preparing for the officials that he would soon have to persuade. What's important here, and I think what we see in Nehemiah, is sometimes we get ahead of ourselves when we're trying to wait and see what God's doing. We jump the gun and we get really ready to go. And it's not even that we're doing anything wrong, but to see God work through things, we have to be patient and wait for him to kind of fully invest in the situation. Sometimes we, like they say, put the cart in front of the horse. We're so gung-ho about an idea that, and how many ideas, countless ideas, get put on the floor, the prep room floor because it's not really thought through. They get pushed off the table that are great ideas that maybe God could have done something, but we jumped in front of him. God does the preparing. Here's an important thing, even with preaching as a pastor. There's not a part of this that I'm doing. It's all God's work, right? I don't save people. I don't have the power to change anyone's minds. I don't have the ability to persuade you to do anything. God does. The Holy Spirit does. And so, honestly, it's foolish for me to assume that I can take charge without him fully be behind me. Like, hey, I'm going to go do this. I'm going to do it. Well, wait a minute. God's the one that has all the ability and the power and the gifting. I'm jumping the gun here, and it's dangerous for me to do that. Now, I'm not going to lie. I've tried it a few times. And every single time, it's never amounted to anything. Right? Now, I've also waited and patiently allowed God to move in things and gone when he's called me to go. And I've seen great things happen in those moments because, like I said, I don't have the ability. You don't have the ability. God does. What we can take from Nehemiah is this very thing. He patiently was faithful to wait on God to prepare for a great thing. And we're going to read later on in Nehemiah what all he does. But he doesn't jump the gun and get ahead of himself. He's waiting and calculating and doing all the work so God can use him in a way that's great and mighty. And it's important for us to learn that sometimes God doesn't so much need us. Not sometimes, he doesn't need us. But oftentimes God's waiting for us to just be patient so he could use us. One of the things that I don't want to say I fear this, but one of the things I don't want to do is I don't want to miss an opportunity because I decided to do it without him. And he was going to do something great anyway, but because of my foolishness, God's like, nah, you're not ready for this, Nick. I want God to be willing to use me because I'm a vessel willing to be used. Now, I struggle with that all the time. I'm still going through this, but as a believer, I'm trying to faithfully wait and be patient on him. And I want to encourage you as we leave to be faithful and patient, to be ready when the opportunity comes to ask a faithful request, but then also to be faithfully ready to prepare for what God is doing in your life personally, as a church, as a community. And so